All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank y'all so much for braving game day traffic to be here with us today. My name is Ollie Jennings, and I would like to welcome you to the Fayetteville Public Library. I also want to give a shout out and say welcome to the viewers who are watching with us through live stream. Today, I want to give a special shout out to the University of Arkansas Multicultural Center. They are the partners for today's event, and they have been instrumental in helping us spread the word and get this event started. Be sure that you stop by their table on the way outside and say hi. Another little note before we get started. We have these event feedback forms right over here at this table next to the doors. We would request that you give some feedback on today's program, and if you'd like, you can also share any ideas for future programming. We do use these forms whenever we're planning our future events, and we'd love to hear from y'all. And with that, I would love to introduce today's panel. Our moderator today is Cira Abiseid. Our panelists are Dr. Stephanie Ho from Vector Health and Wellness, Dr. Asher Morgan from the University of Arkansas, and Dr. Ren Pepitone, also from the University of Arkansas. Cira Abiseid is a Master of Social Work student at the University of Arkansas. She plans to work in therapy and outreach with LGBTQIA+ youth in order to increase their equal access to representation, resources, and quality of life. Dr. Stephanie Ho is a physician at Vector Health and Wellness here in town, where she works with another provider to provide gender-affirming care for all. She is also a member of the City of Fayetteville Board of Health and a fellow through Physicians for Reproductive Health. Dr. Asher Morgan is a health and wellness educator at U of A. Didn't know that was a tongue twister. Throughout their 10 years on campus, they have worked to increase space and visibility for LGBTQ+ students, faculty, and staff with a particular focus on trans and non-binary individuals. Dr. Ren Pepitone is an assistant professor of history at the University of Arkansas. Their research focuses on the constructions of masculinities in Great Britain and its empire, with a particular focus on the intersections of gender, race, class, and geography. They teach a variety of classes on gender and culture, including LGBTQ+ histories. Please help me welcome today's panel.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you to everyone for being here and for your interest in our discussion today. We are honored to have such subject matter experts here to discuss these very, very poignant issues at a time when we need representation in the state for this very at-risk community. I'm going to ask one question. All of the panelists will then answer the question, and we will move through at that time. We do have some questions at the end that were submitted by the audience ahead of time, so Ollie will be reading those questions, and they will answer those as well. I would now like each guest to please share a little about yourself, starting with your name, pronouns, and how you currently identify.
I'm Dr. Stephanie Ho, she, her pronouns, cisgender female. I am a family physician. I own a clinic, Vector Health and Wellness, and we are a clinic that provides gender-affirming primary care, hormone replacement therapy, and sexual reproductive health.
My name is Dr. Asher Morgan. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as non-binary transmasculine. I work at the University of Arkansas. I've been there for 10 years and providing wellness education. And I've lived in Arkansas most of my life. So I consider myself a native Arkansan. Lived in the Delta, the River Valley, and now Northwest Arkansas. So I have a pretty good understanding of what it's like to be in this community and live in this state.
I'm Dr. Ren Pepitone. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as non-binary. I am a history professor at the University of Arkansas, particularly working on gender and sexuality, teaching gender and sexuality. And I'm, unlike Asher, very much a transplant to Northwest Arkansas. So I moved here from Baltimore. I'd lived in the Mid-Atlantic until moving out here. So very much have a maybe perspective of from the outside looking in.
Thank you. For our trans and gender non-conforming panelists, when and how did you realize that your gender identity did not match the way society perceived you? Asher?
Yeah, I don't mind to start with that. I would say for me, it's kind of always been there. I didn't have a whole lot of language for it, honestly, until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So I've identified as a lesbian most of my life. And just the more that the world has adapted and accepted and expanded language, it was kind of like a light bulb went off, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. And sometimes that continues to happen with various things, but I would say it's really just been the past 5 to 6 years that I've kind of made that transition from identifying as a lesbian to identifying as non-binary and really understanding what that means for me.
Thank you. Ren?
So for me, I think when I was about 18 or 19, went off to college and encountered the term queer for the first time and felt like that term made a lot of sense to me, connected with my feminism, with my desires and orientations, with a lot of the ways that I was also looking at the world and thinking about norms and power structures and the way that they were unsatisfactory. But it was really only the past 3 or 4 years that I started thinking more about not just being a queer feminist, but a non-binary queer feminist and what that could mean. And I think as a person who, I was assigned female at birth, and there are aspects of femininity that I really do identify with and enjoy, it took a little bit of work for me to come to understand that I was allowed to want to step outside of a conforming gender identity beyond just queer feminism, and that I was allowed to be non-binary, that could apply to me as well. And so I think I had a lot of work to do myself with thinking about labels and maybe my own expectations within queerness and queer communities, and particularly feeling not queer enough in some way that was for me to work through.
Thank you. Very well put. I think it's very important for anyone listening at any point to remember that all experiences around this subject matter are lifelong journeys that morph and change over time, and that they're also a deeply personal experience, and something that each person kind of experiences in a different way. So thank you very much for sharing. What role does your gender identity play in your larger overall identity? Asher?
For me, it's become more about the visibility of it, realizing that, yes, I have this identity, but I also have overarching privilege, especially in race, and trying to be visible in a way that others either don't feel like they can or historically haven't been able to. One of my biggest goals is to try to be for others what I didn't have when I was younger, and so I grew up in the northeast corner of Arkansas in the Delta, and you know, if there were any LGBTQ, specifically transgender individuals in my community, I certainly was not aware of it. And so that's, you know, both within my personal life, but also in my work on campus, just trying to be as visible as I can so that others can see themselves maybe reflected in me and know that they're not alone and that they can, you know, walk proudly through the spaces that they're in.
Yeah, that really resonates for me, Asher, that sense of visibility. I also think a lot about the amount of privilege that I hold in terms of race, and also whether or not I want it. I have passing privilege, particularly not just the way I present, but the size of my body. I'm less than 5 feet tall, and so I'm sometimes perceived as male, as a boy, but very rarely am I perceived as threatening in spaces, and I don't tend to get a lot of pushback about that. And so I try to think about, all right, what does that mean then if I have this privilege? How to be more visibly queer, visibly non-binary, louder about that. But I also think a lot as well about what I had mentioned previously, is that if I'm thinking about gender norms and the way that they're unsatisfactory, gender is intersectional with race and class and a whole variety of other norms. And so in terms of other identities, I think as a radical leftist, to be quite frank, who's interested in thinking through and dismantling certain systems of power, right? For me, non-binary is just one node in the realm of gender on a whole constellation of systems of power that I'm interested in rethinking or trying to push back against.
Thank you very much. How has your gender identity affected your experience in the South? Asher?
Well, I was going to speak only in the sense that I have maybe less experience in the South, but I will say, for me, I don't think I was aware of how I was being read quite so viscerally until I moved here. And then implicit understandings of gender norms that I maybe had not encountered or had not encountered in the same ways. Even things like being at a gathering and having someone ask me, "Oh, is that your husband?" And I turn around and there's just a man getting nacho dip at the line, and it's, no, that's literally a stranger. Or smaller encounters like that. But that made me suddenly keenly aware that I was being perceived as female and with a whole set of expectations that really did not necessarily accord with my sense of self and sense of the way that I wanted to move through the world. That felt much more visible and visceral after moving here.
I would say it's definitely interesting, and in a way it feels like even sometimes a moment to moment turning off parts of me and turning on parts of me. Because sometimes I float through the world, again, having similar privilege of I very much can pass for, a white man. And acknowledging that in certain spaces. But then there are other areas where I'm very hyper aware, especially having a wife and having 2 kids. And the biggest example comes like if we travel somewhere. So if we're going on vacation, say down to Florida, being kind of hyper aware of where's it okay for us to stop? Will I feel safe going to the bathroom here? Am I going to put my family in any kind of awkward situation? Where they either feel like they have to defend me or we feel like we have to leave. And just kind of being hyper aware of those. And I probably am maybe much more than at least the kids are, probably not my wife. She probably thinks about it as well. But moving through that, but then also having that other part of feeling like I'm necessary, like the South needs people like us so that we can start to kind of break down some of those historical systems that have existed and start to change the norms and the thought processes. And it's a very slow process, sometimes very painful process, and as well as an ebb and a flow. You'll feel like you've made some headway and then you get like pushed back 3 or 4 steps. But it's definitely something that's never too far from the consciousness of how will I be perceived, will I be okay here? What services, or not services, but like what's available to me? Can I exist in as my true self in this space, or do I kind of need to code switch into something else, whether it's like altering my voice to either sound more feminine or more masculine, depending on how I'm addressed, and things like that. And so it's almost a constantly feeling like you have to be on and hyper aware almost all the time.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Ho, I would like you to answer this next question as well. How do you feel about the way gender is defined in society?
I think that the gender and sex are, commonly confused. And so a lot of times I think it's just a matter of, helping people understand that there is a difference and that it is important that there's a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you. Asher?
I think also one thing that's really important is to realize that an individual's gender may evolve as they evolve, just like I talked about with mine a few minutes ago. Once I had better language and I learned more, then it was like, oh yes, I actually, feel like I fit into this label or category, because right now we insist on categorizing ourselves based off of these things. And for me, just trying to differentiate and constantly having that conversation of the differences between gender, biological sex, sexual orientation.
Yeah, I think in terms of the world that I wish for sometimes, and what I hope that we're working towards, is a world in which gender just doesn't matter that much, because it doesn't have to, right? Gender is a social norm that we've come to imbue with a lot of meaning, and for some people it can be really powerful to identify as a particular gender, and I'm not trying to take that away from anybody, but could we imagine a world in which people have or don't have gender identities and it doesn't really affect anything at all about their day-to-day or where they can go or what they can do, because at the end of the day, most of the lived effects of gender are social and often from external pressures, right? And so if we can start to imagine how to dismantle those external pressures, right, we could maybe start to imagine a world in which actually how we define gender, or even if we think about it very much, is maybe less fraught and certainly even just less present than it is at present right now.
Great, thank you very much. That was my follow-up question, actually, was how can we make it better? So you articulated that beautifully. Thank you very much. And this is going to be for all the next two questions will be for all the panelists. How do we support identities that fall outside of traditional understandings of gender?
It's important to just let people be who they are. At our clinic, people come to us and we see them as a patient. It's not necessarily a male patient, a trans patient. There's someone there that we're going to take care of. And so I think it's important just to let people be themselves.
Can you repeat it?
Sure. How do we support identities that fall outside of the traditional understandings of gender?
Yeah, for me, it goes back to that visibility piece of, and doing very, very small things. And so thinking about my work at the university, every now and then wearing a shirt that has a rainbow flag on it. I keep a pen in my office that I'll occasionally wear that, says they, them on it. There's also one on my backpack. And for me, it's the more subtle ways. It's also adding things to my class syllabi, educating students on ways that they can, change their name in the system at the U of A to a preferred name. And, just kind of the little things, but for me, it's really just showing up and then trying to be as authentic as I can with the energy I have that day. And it hasn't really gone that badly since, every time I do that. So it's really just trying to show up and let what's gonna happen.
I think on a person-to-person level, there's an answer to this question that is really simple, is you can support someone who's gender nonconforming if they disclose that information by asking what you can do to support them. And it may be that just that question is enough to let them know that you support them, and that can be fine. Or it might be that they have something really concrete and tangible to ask, hey, this coworker or this mutual friend keeps misgendering me and I don't feel comfortable intervening. Can you say something to them or have a conversation? And it might be something as small as that, or it might be, I'm trying to legally change my name right now and it's a real headache. Get coffee with me and just let me vent a little bit. Maybe they won't ask for anything, but if they've already disclosed to you and you feel close enough to them, go ahead. I think, too, understanding that you can support someone in their gender identity without fully understanding that gender identity, and that no one owes you a thorough explanation of who they are or how they identify in order for you to respect that, right? So if someone tells you they're using they, them pronouns and they had never used those pronouns before and you weren't expecting that, you can feel whatever you feel about that, but if you want to support them, right, just say, okay, I'm going to use they, them, right? And know, too, that might require some work on your part to do the mental reprogramming and retooling and remapping. And you might have to think to yourself, okay, whatever person is they, them, and they went to the store and right, actually think that to yourself. But in the scheme of things, if you want to be an ally, spending a little bit of time each day remapping your schema is not actually that hard an ask. And then the last thing I would say, and this is me trying to, I guess, get on my historian soapbox, but is I think sometimes when we talk about the South and queerness in the South, we have this expectation that discrimination is the default, and it's always been that way, and it always will, and there's an inevitability to that. And actually, historically, that has not always been the case. We have a lot of instances of queer people, especially trans men in the rural South or the Midwest, who found a lot of acceptance within their communities, even when they were known to be transmasculine, because they were good neighbors or good providers, because they fit in other ways or upheld standards or helped people. And I think that sometimes when we talk about discrimination as inevitable, we make it feel really hopeless for people, or we close off a future that looks different to our own imagination. And I just want to say that maybe knowing that in the past, discrimination was not the norm and the default, and that there was actually a lot of cultural work done on the part of conservatives and transphobic and homophobic people in order to instill those norms, that just envisioning a future without them can be, I think, a way of helping, not just on an interpersonal level, but on a broader community level.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And this is going to be our last formal question, and then we will shift to Ollie for the questions from online. What would you say to anyone listening who may be exploring their gender identity, or as a follow-up to that, what would you say to someone who knows someone who may be exploring their gender identity?
I would say, and I was going to add this to what Ren said. First off, if someone discloses to you that they're transgender, nonconforming, lesbian, gay, bisexual, any of those, know that there's an immense amount of trust there. Like, on some level, they feel like they are safe with you, and how you react in that moment is very important. And it can help a lot of things. It can also create some barriers down the line, how you react in that moment. But for me, I would say, if you're struggling with that, is to continue to explore it. There are a lot of resources online now, both within the state and across the nation. And we're ever increasing our language and having the conversation and looking for, you can even Google now that you want, a physician or a therapist, or you can look at Pride Index when you're searching for a university to see how safe those populations are. And then just within the community, looking for the like-minded people. And it may take a little bit, but know that there are people like me and Ren and Dr. Ho and Cira that are out there trying to be as visible as we can be, so that you have that space, if you ever need somebody to talk to disclose it. And we're not the only ones. And that you aren't alone in what you're going through, and it may feel very isolating in that moment, but there are people out there that will support you, will love you, and do understand on some level the process of what you're navigating through. Even though it is very individual, some parts of it are understood on some level by anyone that walks that path.
Yeah, I think that was beautifully put, and really just reiterating that, one, believing you can find your people, and that there are people out there who will support you and love you, and that even if they don't have the same exact experience, if they're not going through the same exact thing, right? And I think that's what I was saying too about not taking discrimination as inevitable, right? There are such incredible queer communities and other sort of pockets of support here in Arkansas that knowing they're there, believing you can find them, right? That's really important. To someone transitioning or thinking about their gender identity, I think one thing I would also say is trust yourself, and trust that if you're feeling something, that's okay, and it's okay to explore, and also it's okay not to know, or to try on an identity and say, actually, this doesn't fit, this isn't quite right, and try on something else. And that I think in that process, it's easy to feel like, oh no, I'm a fraud, I've said I was this, or I was trying to be that, and it wasn't true, and now no one's ever going to believe me. And just trust that the people in your life who get it and who are there to support you are gonna be there to let you move through whatever process or journey you need to take in order to figure out what is right for you and who you do want to be and how it makes sense for you to move through the world.
I would add one thing to that, if I may. If you're trying to support someone that has disclosed this information to you and you're struggling with it, realize that it wasn't a choice. If anything, they've probably spent a great deal of time trying to choose not to be what they have just disclosed to you that they feel like they are. And I think that's really important, especially in the South and Arkansas. That's kind of this misnomer that goes with our culture, is that this is a choice that we make. It's a lifestyle that you're choosing, and it's not. You know, like I said, I know for me personally, I spent a good number of years trying to pray it away, trying to be like, this isn't true. This isn't who I am. It can't be. And know that they're struggling with that if they've disclosed this to you. And it wasn't a choice that they made, because nobody would choose to put themselves in, you know, a minoritized population that faces discrimination, any type of physical, verbal, emotional abuse. We would never choose that if we didn't have to.
And if I can add one more thing to that too, I think if you're trying to support someone, it's probably better that you try to address them as they ask and get it wrong and apologize and let them know that they're trying, than to worry that you're going to get it wrong, not try at all, and just misgender or in some other way cause some sense of dysphoria, right? I think people understand that there are mistakes and mess ups, but at least from personal experience, right, having folks in my life, especially family members, struggle and get things wrong or make mistakes still feels a whole lot better than when it feels like they're just ignoring, you know, what I've told them about myself. So,
From a medical standpoint, being a medical provider, it's always important for people who are exploring their gender identity to make sure that you're creating a safe space so that they can be who they feel like they are. One of the important things too is, you know, just not making assumptions. If someone comes to you and say, I would like to be on testosterone therapy, not making an assumption that's a trans man. Non-binary patients, you know, choose to become, to take hormones to masculinize or to feminize, and basically letting them know that that's okay, and understanding that their goals for therapy may evolve, and that's okay too.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have anything else to add? This beautifully said by all, but I definitely want to hold space for it if there's anything. Ollie?
All right, so now we are going to move into some questions that were submitted by the audience prior to the event. Let's start with, what local policies are affecting the trans and gender nonconforming population that need to change, and what changes can be made to better support this population?
So as far as local policies, I'm not a politician, I'm not super involved in those type of things, but what I do know is that things that come down from the state that apply locally a lot of times can you know, be challenging to gender nonconforming people and you know, people who care about those people. And so of course, you know, we've all heard about the legislature wanting to take away care for trans youth, and, you know, that trickles down locally as well. You know, they've also said that, you know, teachers are required to use, you know, the pronouns that match their, you know, gender assigned at birth, and they're required to use, like, legal names. But things like that, that come down, you know, from the state to local, can really impact, you know, someone's ability to be, you know, comfortable in a space and to feel safe in an area.
I would second most of that and don't really have a whole lot to add to it. As far as local policies, I know that at least for Fayetteville, that Mayor Jordan and the city have done a lot of work to try to be inclusive of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. Sometimes that gets shut down by the state at large, depending on, you know, certain factors. But a lot can be done to increase that. I don't have all the answers, and I tend to kind of point them out as they come to my awareness. But I do know that starting with the school system and Department of Education, which again is more of a state thing than a local thing, but you know, acknowledging, allowing people to use the bathroom that, you know, I mean, we're not trying to do anything in the bathroom other than what anybody else does in a bathroom. And if anything, we're more cautious and just trying to get in and out quicker than most cisgender heterosexual people are, because it gives us so much anxiety to just to have to go in there if it's not a single bathroom, that heads down, not making eye contact. There are times where, like, I don't even like to wash my hands. I would rather just keep hand sanitizer ready so that I can make a very quick exit. And so things like that, you know, but applying language, and if you are in a position to create policy or edit policy, you know, maybe inviting, if you have any that you're aware of on your staff or in your circles, you know, transgender, nonconforming, other LGBTQ individuals, to help with language, because sometimes it's just as simple as changing some verbiage to the collective they instead of, you know, gendering it. And just, it's a constant ongoing process like everything else.
Yeah, I really want to second just how far simple things like changes in language can go to make a space feel inclusive, or to sort of signal to trans and non-binary people that they're seen and included in a space. And then this isn't necessarily the most, I don't know, insightful point, but just noting that when laws come down from the state, like the women in sports law that was recently passed, even trans and gender nonconforming people that doesn't directly affect, right? So even people who are not children trying to play on a sports team, it's still, I think we as in the community feel the impact and reverberation of the fact that the state legislature is passing discriminatory legislation, right? And that there's an emotional or a psychic effect to that kind of legislation that goes well beyond just the direct individuals that the laws particularly target.
I wanted to expand a little bit. You had mentioned that our mayor is very supportive, and kind of, you know, to address what changes can be made to better support this population. I was invited to serve on the Fayetteville City Board of Health, and I thought I was incredibly privileged to do that, but I was so glad, because then I knew that this population would have at least a voice somehow in how, you know, policy is discussed and you know, addressed and things like that. So I think that our city has definitely made those efforts, and I'm glad to see that.
Great, thank you. Ollie?
Okay, can we talk a little bit about chest binder safety? For example, is it safe for a 13-year-old to wear a binder? And maybe explain what a binder is for those in the audience who may not be aware.
Okay, so it is safe for a 13-year-old to wear a binder. Binders are basically garments that will help the chest appear more flat, and usually the recommendations are to wear a dedicated binder or sports bra. They definitely discourage using, you know, ace wrap, plastic wrap, duct tape. That can definitely do a whole lot of damage. It's always important to make sure that, you know, the binder is the correct size. You want to make sure that you're, you know, selecting proper material that can breathe, because of course having something against your skin for long periods of time, especially with sweating, can increase the risk of, you know, skin irritation, infection. It's important to not use the binder more than 8 to 10 hours a day. And then I typically like to tell my patients to take a day off if they're able to, but definitely not sleeping in the binder. But the important thing is to use a dedicated binder if that's possible.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, as someone that's used one, if someone you know, especially talking most specifically to parents and guardians here, if, you know, a child comes to you and says that they want to do this, try to find them one. And there are companies out there that make them, then they're really good. They are sometimes expensive, but there are organizations as well that have donation programs, and so you can request one. Because I will say, like, you denying them a binder probably isn't going to stop them from binding. It's just going to push them towards more secretive ways, towards using an ace bandage or, other ways that have proven to be a little bit more harmful. If they don't feel like they can safely come to you and ask for one. And I realize it may, make you uncomfortable, but it's just them trying to be more who they are and present to the world more who they are, and will lead to them being, significantly lighter and happier in how they're able to move through the world.
There are a lot of organizations that provide binders. It's also important to know that there are organizations who, for people who cannot afford them, can get binders. And then I know locally, Good Shepherd Lutheran Church has a program where they are able to provide free binders to patients who request them.
Wonderful, thank you. Ollie?
What challenges are posed by transitioning after menopause or later in life, such as testosterone treatments and top surgery? Maybe we can talk a little bit about what those treatments are for anyone in the audience who may not know.
Okay, this is kind of a loaded question, but we'll kind of start from the basics. So in terms of transitioning after menopause, we always think about things like, cardiovascular risks, so risk of heart attack or stroke. We think of, risk of osteoporosis or, the bone strength and those type of things. And so one of the things that, at our practice we make sure is we have an informed consent-based model where we make sure that our patients know exactly, what risks are posed by whatever hormone that they choose. And as long as the patient understands those risks, or, if they need more information, we make sure that we provide that. But it is possible to transition after menopause. It's possible to transition safely, including, with hormones and surgery. It's just a matter of making sure that you're, upfront with your provider so that, we have all the information that we need to kind of help, make the safest plan and guide you to the, safest types of treatments that we can.
All right. I recently read that gender-affirming surgeries in Colorado are now covered under insurance. How close are we to getting coverage in Arkansas or Missouri?
So I can't speak for Missouri, but what I can say is that gender-affirming surgery is covered by some insurances in Arkansas. It's not something that's easily obtained by any means. So definitely having a provider or a clinic that's willing to, do the paperwork, fight with the insurance, all of those things. But it is possible to get it covered in Arkansas under some insurances.
Awesome. What is a polite way to ask someone their pronoun preference?
I would just say ask, as long as you're not coming in with like a condescending or like sarcastic tone. It's not really an offensive question. And as someone that uses they, them, I would much rather you ask than kind of awkwardly stumble through the trial and error of maybe guessing and getting it wrong, because that also puts me in a position to have to correct, and then that makes things weird. And so I have people ask, honestly, pretty frequently, working at the U of A. And yeah, just ask. And the notion of preference is kind of phasing out. It's similar to a name. Like, it's not your preference. These are the pronouns I use. And so for me, they're they, them. And it's not a preference, it's what my pronouns are.
Yeah, I think the simple question of, oh, hi, can I ask your pronouns is a good way. You could also offer your own pronouns if you're introducing yourself to someone. So if I say, hey, I'm Ren, my pronouns are they, them, right? That invites whoever I'm introducing myself to do the same back, right? So that's another easy way. But yeah, I think asking is good.
Is there any delineation between non-binary and trans identities?
Yes. Or sometimes. I don't know how to.
Yeah, it's like the middle of the afternoon, so delineation is throwing me off. I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so for me, I identify as non-binary transmasculine. Basically what that means is gender-wise, I don't identify with any specific gender, but the transmasculine part is more about how I present and carry myself through the world. So I prefer to dress more masculine. This is the haircut I've had predominantly for most of my life. I tend to lean towards what would be more stereotypically assumed as like male preferenced activities and things that I like. But that's not necessarily true for everyone. You can be non-binary and not trans, and trans and not non-binary. It's not specific. Like everything that we're learning in relation to LGBTQ and gender and so many other things in our society, it's a spectrum and it ebbs and flows. And for some people it is even this way one day and this way another day, and realizing that that's okay, and just trying to appreciate the person for who they are when they're with you.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. So I identify as non-binary, but do not identify as trans. And there's a whole host of complicated reasons that go along with that without trying to get into too much, but some of it is, again, I tend to think historically. I tend to think about what being trans has meant to and for people for the past 50 years. And there are certain aspects of that history that don't feel like they're mine in a way that I actually want to be very respectful of, again, because of some of the privileges that I carry, where I don't want to feel like I'm maybe, let's say, appropriating a term that doesn't feel as if it belongs to me or if it should belong to me. So that has to do with part of the way I identify.
Okay, what do you think the future looks like for education regarding the gender binary, or more importantly, the removal of?
I mean, I think as a society, I can't speak for Arkansas as a state, but as a society, we're slowly getting there. I don't remember which state it was a few weeks ago or maybe a month ago that added the option of putting an X on your driver's license instead of male or female. And there are several states out there that do that. I think it will take a dramatic shift to completely remove it from our society's vernacular, because we, at least right now, cling to all of these socially created categories as ways of not just defining ourselves, but also kind of strategizing and creating a hierarchy. And those at the top of that hierarchy will probably cling to that for as long as they can. But I think in regard to education, it's just creating the space, coming to things like this, even providing moments like this, so that we can have the conversation, so that questions can be asked in a non-judgmental and a non-shameful way, and allowing people to respond to them. That don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but I have my experience and can speak to things within that. And I know that it's just, there are people in the community across Northwest Arkansas that are working with local schools. When you think education, you think schools, to also try to get more verbiage in there, to get more support groups, whether it's, PFLAGs within schools, or, I'm losing gay straight alliances within schools, just for awareness, because also more and more our younger generations are ready for that conversation, and these types of things, they see kind of the damage that they do, and are doing a lot of work to try to undo them at that level as well.
I think I would also add to that, and I realize that we're sitting here as a panel of quote-unquote experts, right, with doctors and whatever, but I would say when it comes to education, listen to young people. They're doing a lot of the pioneering work regarding gender and exploding gender norms. Every year that I teach, I'm consistently more and more impressed with how much my students already know about gender history, gender norms, and the things they teach me or challenge me to rethink. And so I think one way of thinking about education is less this top-down model and more, let's look at the work being done on the ground from the bottom up, and educate ourselves about what's going on out in the streets and among young people.
And that's where the support and empowerment comes, because that will circle around. And I tell my students at U of A, but I would tell any, high school, junior high, middle school students this as well, that they have so much more power when policy change comes about than staff, than faculty, when the students kind of rise up and they don't get everything met, so they need soft places to fall when they get let down because they don't get everything that they ask for. But just trying to empower them, and that's where y'all come in and either within the community or people supporting individuals in the community to realize that the younger generations are the ones that will actually be able to get the policy change, the law changes implemented. But it's how we lay the foundation of support for them to know that they can, step into themselves and do that.
So just to expand, I believe that Arkansas does allow a gender marker of X. And I wanted to kind of address this question from kind of a different angle. So one of the things that is one of our personal goals at my clinic is to make sure that we're educating basically new providers to be gender affirming in their care, whatever care that they decide to provide. And so whenever I was in medical school, and this is still for the most part true, the only thing that I learned about LGBTQ health was in the context of STDs. And I thought that was incredibly insulting, and literally I learned nothing else until I sought that education. So I think it's important, in addition to general education, but that providers who do perform this care help others, like nurses and upcoming doctors, be able to provide this care in an affirming way, in a sensitive way, and know how to create safe spaces, know how to use pronouns and preferred names. So from that standpoint, educating the up-and-coming providers that will eventually be taking care of you.
Great, thank you, Ollie.
Beautifully said. Are there any support groups or other services you wish you'd had as a trans or gender nonconforming teen? Follow-up question, how can local organizations best support trans youth?
I mean, for being the one, I'm making an assumption here, so correct me, Dr. Howe, that the one like raised in Arkansas, none of this was talked about in my little tiny town in the northeast corner of this state. And honestly, I'm not sure it would be talked about there today. At least not in a forum like this. It's a very small, a very rural, conservative, Christian, predominantly Southern Baptist community of about 3,000 people. And so we didn't have any of this. And, thinking about public schools and support groups and gay straight alliances, or, was at a program the other day for resources and the number of religious organizations that were there. I didn't grow up with that either. Like, it was just completely off limits and, not something that was talked about, but it was also very much so through that silence made clear that it was not okay. It was not accepted. And I think just that local organizations, it can be something as small as putting one of, the trans inclusive pride flags in the corner or somewhere on your marketing materials or a window or your social media pages to, or putting a rainbow in your bio. Like, it's really little things like that that tells me when I'm looking through things or exploring somewhere new, like, oh, I'm safe here. And they may not completely understand who I am or my experience, but I also know that I'm, on the large, not going to have a negative experience here.
Like I said, I grew up in the Northeast, but I think the culture there, I was a teen in the early 2000s, and the culture there was, it's okay to be gay as long as it's theoretical and not you and not here, right? So we can talk about gay cultural icons or like watch a play with gay people, and that's fine, but no one in our high school was coming out, or the one person who did faced a lot of stigma. Our GSA was shut down. So this is, I think 20 years later, it's a really different climate, and that's heartening to see. In terms of trans youth, I also, I don't have great ideas, let's say, that are easy or practical, but I think for local organizations that want to support trans youth, understanding the particularities that trans youth face, so maybe that's coming out to family members and losing a home because of that, or the fact that trans youth face not only the stigma that other trans people face, but also often have access to even fewer resources, right? Because they're not yet adults. So understanding that what trans youth need might in some level be very material, basic resources, and having those at hand, I think is important for going along with other forms of emotional support and allyship.
Ollie?
Beautiful. How can we create a more welcoming workspace and medical space?
Well, as far as medical space, just making sure that there are things there that are affirming. So at our clinic, when you walk in the door, it's very, very clear that we take care of the LGBTQ population. We see other patients as well, but I thought it was very important to make that just very visible. There's no confusion, because there aren't a whole lot of safe spaces that gender nonconforming people and patients can reliably go to. And so just making sure that there's, just put a rainbow. I mean, anything that you can do just so that people recognize that you see them, you respect them.
I would also add to that we need to do, I don't know that I have a good answer how, but making sure that allyship isn't purely performative, right? So I think it is really important to have visible markers of safe spaces and people who are allies, but if those markers are only someone going so far as like, oh, I put a rainbow here, now everything's fine, that doesn't do enough. And I think we really have to fix the way that we do diversity trainings, for example, where they're often farmed out to external companies. They're kind of a thing that you have to click through. They're a hassle. And they also tend to discuss various forms of diversity as if no one in the room actually maybe has some of those identities, and as if no one in your department or whatever, organization of work that you have has those identities. And I think that's really, really harmful because it takes people's lives and lived identities and makes them kind of abstract, and then doesn't actually give people tools to interact with their coworkers in ways that are, I think, productive and supportive. So that's something I would think about.
I would say too, we have to, when you think about those trainings and programming for staff, regardless of the field that they're in, you have to be able to cultivate a space. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to lay that foundation before you can even get to this conversation. But you have to be able to have these conversations where people that are trying to grow and learn and expand can, feel like they have this space to ask questions without the shame of being wrong. Because shame often either shuts down the conversation and they're unwilling to want to learn to grow, or they don't ask the questions because they're afraid of how they're going to be perceived, or that they're going to get a bad reaction, or they're going to hear themselves being talked about in the hallway, a couple of hours after the thing is over. And none of that is helpful. And to realize that, not just for, LGBTQ issues, but pretty much all diversity issues, this is going to be lifelong work for everyone. And being able to, I'm sitting up here on this stage, just willing to be vulnerable. I'm in no way an expert on this, and am constantly learning both within my own communities, but also about many, many others as well. And that it's an ongoing process, and that you're going to trip and you're going to get things wrong, and you have to be able to pick each other up through that, or you're never going to get very far. And then it's also going to create, animosity within your workplace as well, if you don't feel like you can have that open space to explore and learn together. Because we're never all going to come to the same starting line and be like, okay, cool, now we can all walk together. We all come from different areas, families, so many, all of the classifications that we have are different for every person in this room in subtle ways, and have to realize that we're never going to all be in the same place at the same time. And so we just have to learn to be vulnerable and let each other kind of make mistakes without criticizing.
All right, and I think because of time, this is going to be our final question for the day. Are there any local LGBTQI plus led trainings or seminars available for businesses to invite for educational purposes?
I think this one's all me. So I know that the one specifically that I know of is housed in the university, but they don't always work just with the university. It's called the Ideals Institute. I do not know the complete spectrum of the programs and services that they offer for the community, but I do know you can just Google their website and they have a ton of stuff readily available there that you can learn to educate yourself if you're looking to do this for your business or trying to bring this type of work to your workplace, and that can at least get you to a starting point and then going from there. And then I am pretty confident in that staff that if they don't feel like they're the best, people to provide that for you, they probably know who in the community is and would be a better resource for you. And it's called the Ideals Institute.
All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. That is going to be our panel today. Let's give a big thank you to all of our panelists. Okay, so like I said, we have event feedback forms over here next to the door, and please be sure that you stop by and check out the community resources that we have outside, okay? We have some awesome people here today. Hope y'all have a great evening.